What is he doing to my daughter? Ngozi whispered the words, her voice barely audible, as she stood frozen outside the slightly ajar door. She had returned home earlier than expected from the market, her instincts pushing her to hurry. Something felt off. Amaka's muffled cries were louder than usual, filled with a kind of desperation that sent shivers down her spine. Through the gap in the door, she saw Emeka, her younger brother, crouched over her 1-year-old daughter. His grip on the baby's tiny arms was tight, and Amaka's trembling sobs echoed in the small room. Ngozi's heart raced as horrifying thoughts flooded her mind. What was he doing to her? Was he hurting her? The baby let out a sharp, wailing cry that shattered Ngozi's hesitation. Without thinking, she pushed the door open, her voice trembling with fury. "Emeka, what are you doing to my child?" Startled, Emeka flinched, releasing Amaka, who collapsed onto the mat, her cries turning into wails of distress. He turned toward Ngozi, his face a mixture of guilt and defiance. "She wouldn't stop crying," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. Ngozi rushed to Amaka, scooping her into her arms. The baby clung to her tightly, her small hands gripping Ngozi's blouse as though seeking refuge. Ngozi stroked her daughter's back, trying to calm her, but her eyes never left Emeka. "She's a baby, Emeka," Ngozi shouted, her voice shaking. "What could she have done to deserve this? How could you treat her like this?" Emeka's expression darkened. "You act like she's perfect," he snapped. "She cries all the time and you leave me here to deal with it. Do you know how exhausting it is?" "She's my child," Ngozi retorted, her voice rising. "I trusted you to care for her while I worked to keep this house running. Instead, I find you hurting her. What kind of man does that to his own niece?" Emeka's bitterness spilled over. "Oh, here we go again," he spat. "You always think you're better than me. Ever since Mama and Papa died, you took over like you were my mother. You controlled my life, treated me like a burden. And now you expect me to sit here and babysit your child while you parade around the market?" Ngozi's chest tightened at his words, her mind flashing back to the sacrifices she had made for him after their parents passed. She had given up so much to ensure he had a chance at life. But now his resentment overshadowed all of that. "You've betrayed me, Emeka," she said, her voice cold and resolute. "I brought you into my home because I believed in you. But I see now I was wrong. You have no place here anymore." Emeka opened his mouth to argue, but the steely determination in Ngozi's eyes silenced him. Without another word, she turned and left the room, holding Amaka close to her chest. Protecting her daughter was now her only priority. Hello family, welcome to Stories with JAYVIL. Please subscribe and leave a like for us. It means the world to us. Also share this video to your friends and loved ones, and remember to turn on the post notifications so you don't miss any future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Now sit back and relax as we dive into the story. Once upon a time, Ngozi had always been a pillar of strength. In the quiet town of Umuazuka, she lived with her 1-year-old daughter, Amaka, in a modest home. Life had not been easy since her husband's passing, but Ngozi faced her challenges with determination. She worked tirelessly, selling fresh vegetables in the market to make ends meet. Her younger brother, Emeka, had recently fallen on hard times. When he reached out asking for help, Ngozi saw an opportunity to rebuild their relationship. After all, she had raised Emeka after their parents passed away, sacrificing her own youth to ensure he had a future. Inviting him into her home felt like the right thing to do. At first, everything seemed perfect. Emeka played with Amaka, helped with chores, and even earned the admiration of neighbors. "You're lucky to have such a helpful brother," Mama Uju often told Ngozi. But beneath his charm, Emeka carried a bitterness he couldn't shake. Memories of Ngozi's strictness during their childhood lingered, twisting into resentment. While he smiled in public, behind closed doors the cracks began to show. And that fateful day, Ngozi realized the full extent of his bitterness at the expense of her innocent child. At first, Ngozi convinced herself that everything was fine. Emeka, her younger brother, had only been staying with her for a few weeks, and the adjustment period was bound to be rocky. She reminded herself of how much she had sacrificed to raise him after their parents passed. Now that he was in need, it was her duty to help him. Still, small signs began to trouble her. It started with his temper. While Emeka had always been a bit short-tempered, He had never directed it toward Amaka before. Now, whenever the 1-year-old cried or fussed, his frustration was palpable. At first, it was subtle, an exasperated sigh or a muttered complaint. But over time, Ngozi began to notice how quickly he snapped. One afternoon, as Ngozi prepared to leave for the market, she handed Amaka over to Emeka. "Please look after her," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I'll be back before the sun sets." Emeka nodded, but his jaw tightened. "Of course, I'll take care of her," he replied curtly, avoiding her eyes. Ngozi hesitated, feeling a pang of doubt, but she brushed it aside. She had no choice but to trust him. As soon as Ngozi left, Amaka began to cry. Emeka clenched his fists, his patience already worn thin from the day. He picked her up awkwardly, trying to bounce her on his knee, but the baby only cried louder. "Why can't you ever stop crying?" Emeka muttered under his breath. He set her down roughly on the mat and stepped back, running his hands through his hair. The baby's cries grew louder and Emeka's irritation flared. "You're doing this on purpose, aren't you?" he snapped, glaring at her. Amaka, of course, couldn't understand his words, but his tone made her sobs more frantic. Later that day, when Ngozi returned, she found Amaka unusually quiet. The baby clung to her mother's wrapper, refusing to let go, her eyes red from crying. Ngozi glanced at Emeka, who sat on the edge of the bed, his expression unreadable. "Was everything all right?" Ngozi asked, her voice laced with concern. "Fine," Emeka replied tersely, not looking at her. "She just cried a bit, nothing I couldn't handle." Ngozi studied him for a moment, then turned her attention to Amaka. Something didn't feel right, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Over the next few days, Ngozi began to notice other troubling signs. Amaka, who had always been playful and cheerful, seemed unusually clingy and quiet whenever Emeka was around. She would startle at sudden movements and bury her face in Ngozi's chest. Ngozi's suspicions grew, but she couldn't bring herself to confront Emeka. Instead, she tried to manage the situation by spending more time at home and leaving Amaka with Emeka only when absolutely necessary. But deep down, she knew the cracks were beginning to show, and it was only a matter of time before everything fell apart. Ngozi's concerns grew heavier with each passing day. Amaka's behavior had changed. The once cheerful child now clung to her mother constantly, crying whenever Ngozi tried to hand her over to Emeka. At first, Ngozi attributed it to the baby's usual mood swings, but the nagging feeling that something was wrong refused to leave her. One sunny afternoon, the neighborhood children gathered near Ngozi's home to play. Their laughter filled the air as they chased one another and kicked an old rubber ball around. Inside, however, the atmosphere was tense. Amaka's cries pierced through the lively sounds outside, drawing the children's attention. Chinedu, a bold 10-year-old boy known for his curiosity, stopped playing and turned toward the window of Ngozi's home. He peered through the narrow gap in the curtain. What he saw made his young face wrinkle with confusion and unease. Inside, Emeka was gripping Amaka tightly, his voice harsh as he muttered angrily. The baby flailed her arms, her cries growing louder. Chinedu's heart raced. He stepped back from the window and called to his friends. "What's wrong, Chinedu?" one of the children asked. "It's Amaka," he replied, his voice low. "I think something's wrong with her uncle." The children exchanged worried glances but didn't dare approach the house. Instead, they ran to Chinedu's mother, Mama Uju, who was washing clothes nearby. "Mama Uju, something is wrong with Amaka," Chinedu blurted out, his words tumbling over each other. "I saw her uncle holding her too tightly, and she was crying a lot." Mama Uju paused, her hands still submerged in soapy water. She frowned, her maternal instincts kicking in. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice stern. "Yes, Mama," Chinedu said, nodding vigorously. "I saw it with my own eyes." That evening, whispers began to spread through the neighborhood. The women at the communal well murmured amongst themselves, their voices low but urgent. "Did you hear about Emeka?" one woman said. Chinedu said he saw him handling Amaka roughly. "It's not the first time I've heard the baby crying like that," another added. "Something isn't right in that house." "Poor Ngozi," Mama Uju said, shaking her head. "She works so hard and now this. She needs to know what's happening." By the next morning, the whispers had reached Ngozi herself. As she walked to the market, neighbors stopped her with concerned looks. Ngozi, is everything okay with Emeka? Mama Uju asked carefully. We've been hearing things about how he handles Amaka. Ngozi's heart sank. She had been trying to ignore her own suspicions, hoping she was wrong. But now, with others noticing, she realized she could no longer turn a blind eye. It was time to confront the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The day after the whispers reached Ngozi, she resolved to come home early from the market. Her heart was heavy with worry, and the growing tension between her and Emeka had become unbearable. She needed to see for herself if the suspicions were true. It was mid-afternoon when she approached her home, the sun casting long shadows across the yard. As she neared the door, Amaka's cries reached her ears. Sharp and desperate, Ngozi froze, her grip tightening on the basket she carried. Her heart pounded as she set the basket down and moved cautiously toward the house. Pushing the door open slightly, she peered inside. The sight before her made her blood run cold. Emeka was crouched over Amaka, gripping her small arms tightly as he muttered angrily. The baby's tiny body shook with sobs, her face red and tear-streaked. "Why can't you just stop crying?" Emeka growled, his voice low but filled with frustration. Ngozi's anger erupted like a storm. She pushed the door open fully and stepped inside, her voice trembling with fury. "Emeka, what are you doing to my child?" Startled, Emeka flinched and let go of Amaka, who fell back onto the mat, wailing. He turned to face Ngozi, his expression a mix of guilt and irritation. "She wouldn't stop crying," he muttered defensively. "I was just trying to calm her down." Ngozi rushed to Amaka, scooping her into her arms. The baby clung to her tightly, her sobs quieting slightly as she buried her face in her mother's chest. Ngozi stroked her daughter's back, her anger growing with each passing second. "She's a baby, Emeka," Ngozi shouted, her voice trembling. "Babies cry, that's what they do. How could you treat her like this?" Emeka's expression darkened. "You think you're so perfect," he snapped. "You don't know what it's like to sit here all day, listening to her scream." "I'm tired, Ngozi. I've had enough." Ngozi stared at him in disbelief. "Enough," she said, her voice cold. "You've had enough? What about me, Emeka? I've worked tirelessly to provide for this family, trusting you to take care of my daughter. And this is how you repay me." Emeka's bitterness spilled over. "Oh, here we go," he spat. "You've always acted like you're better than me. Ever since Mama and Papa died, you took over my life, made every decision for me. And now you want me to babysit while you parade around the market? I'm not your servant, Ngozi." Ngozi's chest tightened as his words cut deep. She had sacrificed so much for him, raising him like her own child after their parents passed. But now his resentment was clear and it had turned into something dangerous. Her voice steadied, cold and resolute. "You've betrayed me, Emeka. I welcomed you into my home, trusted you with my child, and you've broken that trust. You need to leave." Emeka opened his mouth to argue, but the fire in Ngozi's eyes silenced him. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the room, holding Amaka close. This was the breaking point, and there was no going back. Later that evening, Ngozi sat in the living room, holding Amaka close to her chest. The baby had finally fallen asleep, her small body still trembling occasionally, as though she were reliving the day's trauma. Ngozi's mind was racing, filled with anger, betrayal, and sadness. She knew she couldn't handle this situation alone. When her husband, Chaik, returned from work, she wasted no time recounting what had happened. Her voice shook with emotion as she described finding Emeka gripping Amaka and the confrontation that followed. Chaik listened in silence, his face growing darker with each detail. "This is unacceptable," Chaik said firmly when she had finished. "Emeka has crossed a line. We can't allow him to stay here any longer." Ngozi nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "I didn't want it to come to this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's my brother, but I can't risk Amaka's safety." Chaik placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Family or not, our daughter comes first," he said. "We'll speak to him together." As the couple entered Emeka's room, they found him sitting on the edge of the bed, his belongings scattered around. He glanced up at them, his expression defiant. "Have you come to throw me out?" he asked bitterly. Chaik stood tall, his tone calm but authoritative. "Emeka, we took you in because you're family. We wanted to help you, but what you've done is inexcusable. You hurt an innocent child, your own niece. This can't be ignored, Emeka scoffed. I didn't hurt her, I was trying to discipline her. But of course, Ngozi will blow everything out of proportion. She's always had a way of making me look like the bad guy. Ngozi's anger flared, but Chaik held up a hand to stop her. He looked directly at Emeka, his gaze unyielding. This isn't about Ngozi or your feelings toward her. This is about your actions. You've made this house unsafe for our daughter, and that's something we can't tolerate. You need to leave. Emeka's jaw tightened as he looked between his sister and her husband. So that's it, he said bitterly. After everything, you're throwing me out like trash. Ngozi's voice softened, though her resolve remained firm. You made this choice, Emeka. I've tried to help you, to give you a place to rebuild your life. But instead of being grateful, you let your bitterness consume you. I can't risk my child's safety for your resentment. The next morning, Emeka packed his belongings into a small bag. As he stepped out of the house, neighbors who had gathered outside watched silently. Many of them nodded approvingly, murmuring among themselves about how brave Ngozi and Chaik were for prioritizing their family's safety. Mama Uju approached Ngozi as Emeka walked away. You've done the right thing, my dear, she said warmly. A mother's first duty is to her child. You've shown strength. Ngozi watched her brother disappear down the road, her heart heavy but resolute. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of peace returning to her home. The days following Emeka's departure were strangely quiet. The tension that had hung over the household like a dark cloud seemed to dissipate overnight. Ngozi felt a weight lift from her chest, even though her heart ached for the brother she had once known. Amaka too began to change. The little girl who had been timid and clingy started to show glimpses of her cheerful self again. She laughed more freely and reached out to explore the world around her. Ngozi saw these small changes as signs that she had made the right decision. One morning, as Ngozi swept the courtyard, Chaik approached her with a smile. It's good to see you looking more relaxed, he said, placing a hand on her shoulder. Ngozi looked up at him, her face softening. I didn't realize how much Emeka's presence was affecting us, she admitted. I wanted to help him, but I never imagined it would come at such a cost. Chaik nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes helping someone means knowing when to let them go, he said. You did everything you could for him, but his actions left you with no choice. Now we can focus on our family. The neighbors were quick to offer their support. Mama Uju stopped by with a basket of freshly picked vegetables. For you and Amaka, she said, handing it to Ngozi. You've shown us all what it means to be a strong mother. Another neighbor, Papa Kini, helped Chaik repair the broken fence in their yard. We're proud of how you handled things, he said. Family is important, but there's no excuse for putting your child at risk. The sense of community gave Ngozi renewed strength. She spent her days tending to her small farm and her evenings playing with Amaka. The baby's laughter filled the house, a sound that had been missing for far too long. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ngozi sat outside with Amaka on her lap. The baby reached for a carved wooden toy that Chinedu, the bold neighborhood boy, had made for her. Amaka's tiny fingers grasped the toy and she giggled as she waved it in the air. Ngozi's heart swelled with emotion as she watched her daughter. Chaik joined them, sitting beside his wife and placing an arm around her shoulders. She's happy again, Chaik said, his voice full of warmth. Ngozi nodded, tears welling in her eyes. She's safe, that's all that matters. Though the house was quieter without Emeka, it was filled with something far more valuable, peace. Ngozi knew that the decision to ask him to leave had been the right one, no matter how painful. Her family's safety and happiness had to come first. As she sat with her husband and daughter under the fading light of the day, Ngozi felt a deep sense of gratitude for the love and support that surrounded her. They were moving forward stronger than ever. News of Emeka's departure spread quickly through the community. Neighbors who had been whispering in concern about Ngozi's situation now openly expressed their support and admiration for her. For a village where family ties were sacred, it was no small matter to ask a relative to leave, but the community understood and applauded Ngozi's bravery. Mama Uju, who had been one of the first to notice something was wrong, visited Ngozi the morning after Emeka left. She brought with her a bowl of freshly cooked jollof rice and fried fish. "You've shown courage, my dear," she said, handing the bowl to Ngozi. "It's not easy to stand up for what's right, especially when it comes to family." "You did what any good mother would do." Ngozi accepted the bowl with a grateful smile. "Thank you, Mama Uju. I just want Amaka to feel safe again." "And she will," Mama Uju replied firmly. "You've already taken the first step." As the days passed, the neighbors began rallying around Ngozi in practical ways. The men helped Chaik fix up the farm, reinforcing the chicken coop and mending broken fences. The women took turns helping Ngozi with household chores, giving her more time to focus on Amaka. Chinedu, the bold young boy who had first raised concerns about Emeka, arrived one afternoon with a small carved wooden toy. It was a bird, carefully shaped and smoothed, painted with bright colors. He handed it to Ngozi shyly. "This is for Amaka," he said, his eyes darting between Ngozi and the ground. "I thought it might make her smile." Ngozi knelt to his level, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, Chinedu. That's very kind of you." She took the toy inside and handed it to Amaka, who grabbed it with eager little hands. The baby giggled as she waved the toy in the air, her laughter filling the room. For the first time in weeks, Ngozi felt a deep sense of relief. One evening, the neighbors gathered in Ngozi's courtyard for a communal storytelling session. It was a tradition in the village to come together and share tales under the light of the moon. As they sat around a crackling fire, Papa Kini stood and addressed the group. "Ngozi's story is not just about a mother protecting her child," he said, his voice deep and steady. "It's about the strength it takes to make difficult decisions. It's about knowing that love sometimes means setting boundaries." The neighbors nodded in agreement, their expressions thoughtful. Many of them looked at Ngozi with newfound respect. As the storytelling continued, Ngozi sat with Chaik, her heart full of gratitude. The love and support of her community had given her the strength to move forward. Amaka, now sitting on her lap and playing with her carved bird, giggled softly. The sound was a balm to Ngozi's soul, a sign that brighter days lay ahead. The sun was warm and bright as Ngozi sat outside her modest home, watching Amaka crawl around on the soft, grassy yard. It had been weeks since Emeka's departure, and the peace that had returned to their home was beginning to show in her daughter's cheerful demeanor. Amaka giggled as she reached for her favorite toy, the colorful wooden bird Chinedu had gifted her. Ngozi smiled as she watched her daughter. "You're getting stronger every day, my little one," she whispered. Chaik, who was tending to the small vegetable garden nearby, looked up. "She's thriving, Ngozi," he said, a hint of pride in his voice. "She knows she's safe now." Amaka waved the wooden bird in the air before dropping it and reaching for her mother. But instead of crawling, she did something unexpected. She placed one hand on the ground, then the other on her knee, and pushed herself up. Ngozi gasped. "Chaik, look!" Chaik wiped his hands on his wrapper and hurried over, his eyes widening as he saw Amaka wobbling on unsteady legs. "She's standing!" Ngozi exclaimed, her heart pounding with excitement. Amaka wobbled for a moment, her little arms stretched out for balance. Then, with a determined look on her face, she took one shaky step forward. "You can do it, Amaka," Ngozi encouraged, her voice filled with joy. The baby took another step, then another, before tumbling into her mother's arms. Ngozi scooped her up and hugged her tightly, tears streaming down her cheeks. "She's walking, Chaik," Ngozi said, her voice trembling with emotion. Chaik chuckled, his eyes glistening with pride. "Our little girl is growing up," he said, placing a hand on Amaka's head. Word of Amaka's first step spread quickly through the neighborhood. By the evening, several neighbors had gathered outside Ngozi's home to congratulate her. "Mama Amaka," Mama Uju called out, "your daughter is becoming a strong little woman, just like her mother." The group erupted in laughter and cheers as Ngozi blushed, holding Amaka close. "She's growing so fast," Ngozi said, her voice filled with gratitude. Later that night, as Ngozi rocked Amaka to sleep, she reflected on how far they had come. The difficult decision to ask Emeka to leave had been painful, but it had brought peace and safety back into their lives. Watching Amaka take her first steps was a reminder of the resilience they had both shown. "You're going to be unstoppable, my little one," Ngozi whispered as she kissed Amaka's forehead. Just like your mama, as Amaka drifted off to sleep, Ngozi felt a deep sense of pride and hope. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to dream of the bright future that lay ahead for her family. By now, the story of what had happened in Ngozi's household had become well known in the small village of Umuazuka. It wasn't just about Emeka's departure. It was about Ngozi's strength as a mother and her unwavering determination to protect her child. Around evening fires and at community gatherings, her story was retold, often accompanied by words of wisdom from the elders. One evening, as the villagers gathered under the large baobab tree at the heart of the community, Elder Namdi stood to address them. The crowd fell silent, their faces illuminated by the flickering glow of lanterns. Ngozi's actions remind us of an important truth, the elder began, his voice steady and commanding. Family is sacred, but so is the safety of our children. When someone threatens that safety, even if they are family, we must act with courage and wisdom. The villagers murmured in agreement. Many of them had seen how Ngozi's household had transformed since Emeka left, and they admired her for making such a difficult decision. Elder Namdi continued, bitterness and anger, when left unchecked, can destroy even the strongest bonds. Emeka allowed his resentment to cloud his judgment, and it cost him the trust of his sister and his place in this village. Mama Uju, who was seated near the front, raised her hand to speak. Ngozi showed us all what it means to be a strong mother, she said. She put her child's safety above all else, even when it meant making a painful choice. That is the kind of strength we should all strive for. As the villagers reflected on these words, many began to share their own thoughts. Some spoke of their admiration for Ngozi, while others used her story as a teaching moment for their children. Chinedu, the young boy who had been instrumental in raising the alarm about Emeka's behavior, sat proudly among the group. His mother, Mama Uju, placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "It takes bravery to speak up no matter how young or old you are." "Chinedu, you did well." The boy beamed and the villagers clapped in acknowledgement of his role in protecting Amaka. Back at home, Ngozi was unaware of the gathering taking place under the baobab tree. She was busy preparing Amaka for bed, humming a soft lullaby as she tucked her daughter in. The peaceful atmosphere of her home was a stark contrast to the tension that had once filled it. As she sat beside Amaka's crib, Ngozi reflected on the lessons she had learned. Family bonds were important, but they could not come at the expense of her child's well-being. Love, she realized, sometimes required tough decisions. The village of Umuazuka would remember Ngozi's story for generations, passing it down as a lesson about strength, love, and the courage to protect what truly matters. And for Ngozi, the peace she had fought for was worth every challenge she had faced. The sun rose over the small village of Umuazuka, casting a warm golden light over Ngozi's home. The once tense atmosphere had been replaced with peace and laughter. Amaka's giggles now echoed through the house, a melody that warmed Ngozi's heart every morning. Ngozi stepped outside, balancing a tray of yams and vegetables on her head. She had resumed her work at the market with renewed energy, knowing her daughter was safe and thriving. Chaik stood nearby, fixing a loose hinge on the door while keeping an eye on Amaka, who played in the yard with her carved wooden bird. "Be careful, Amaka," Ngozi called, smiling as the toddler stumbled forward, determined to chase after a chicken that had wandered into the yard. "She's got your determination," Chaik said with a chuckle. "I don't think anything can stop her." Ngozi laughed softly, her heart swelling with pride. "She's been through so much, but she's stronger because of it." As Ngozi walked to the market, neighbors stopped to greet her, their smiles warm and genuine. Mama Uju, who was sweeping her compound, waved her over. "Ngozi, you look radiant this morning," she said. "How is Amaka?" "She's wonderful," Ngozi replied. "She's walking everywhere now. I can barely keep up with her." Mama Uju chuckled. "That's a good sign. She's thriving because of the love and care you've given her." "You've done well, Ngozi." At the market, business was brisk. Ngozi's stall was busy with customers, many of whom stopped to chat and share encouraging words. The villagers had grown to admire her strength and resilience, seeing her as a symbol of maternal courage. Ngozi said Papa Kini, who was buying some yams, "Your story has taught us all something important. You showed us that family isn't just about blood, it's about trust and love. You've reminded us of what matters most. Ngozi nodded, her eyes glistening with gratitude. Thank you, Papa Kini. I just did what any mother would do. That evening, Ngozi and Chika sat together under the shade of a large mango tree, watching Amaka play in the fading light. The little girl was chasing fireflies, her laughter filling the air like a sweet melody. You've been so strong through all of this, Chike said, turning to Ngozi. I'm proud of you, Ngozi leaned into him, her heart full. I couldn't have done it without you, she replied. We're a team and together we'll give Amaka the life she deserves. As the stars began to twinkle in the sky, Ngozi felt a deep sense of contentment. The struggles she had faced, the hard decisions she had made, they had all been worth it. Her family was safe, happy, and whole. In that moment, Ngozi knew that brighter days lay ahead, and she was ready to face them with love, strength, and the unbreakable bond of her family. We've come to the end of this story. Please subscribe to my channel to support me. Thank you.